Hi students, welcome back to Year 7 Science, and today we are looking at Chapter 3.2 Food Chains. So these are your words for this chapter. First of all, we are learning to recall the words we use to describe how organisms feed. Secondly, we are learning to explain how organisms depend on one another for food. And lastly, we are learning to draw food chains. Alright, before we go into chapter 3.2, I'm going to spend a few moments of your time to do a recap session. So in chapter 3.1, we have learned about ecosystem and environment. So what are ecosystems? Ecosystems are made up of living things, or sometimes we call it biotic factors, and non-living things, or sometimes we call it physical factors or biotic factors that interact with each other in an environment. So let's look at the diagram here. So the living thing in this diagram is actually the bunny and the aquatic plants. Sometimes we call it the biotic factors. And of course, it has to include the non-living things like the rocks, the water, the soil, the air, the sun. These are considered the biotic factors in an ecosystem. So how about an environment? An environment refers to all the other organisms and physical factors around an organism. For example, the bunny. Right? The environment around the bunny includes the other organisms, which is the plant around the bunny, the grass around the bunny, and the physical factors around the bunny. Okay. So next, when we have a group of organisms of the same species, it is called a population. And all different populations living in the same place at the same time are called a community. So here we have populations of zebra, populations of buffalo. So this actually makes up a community. So I'm not going to go deep into this because you have learned it in the previous chapter. And of course, organisms, they have special features. Plants and animals, they have special features that help them to adapt to, firstly, habitat, and to adapt to daily changes, adapt to seasonal changes. So the features, or sometimes we call the characteristics of an organism, help them to thrive and or help them to survive in those kind of conditions. Right, and we're going into food chains. Okay, so organisms, they need food for energy, and the energy is released through respiration. So what is respiration? We have learned it in previous chapters. Respiration is actually a chemical process where we release energy. All right, so respiration and breathing, remember, okay, reminder, respiration and breathing, they are both different things. Okay, breathing is a physical process, whereas respiration is a chemical process where energy is being released. So when we talk about food chains, there are a few roles in a food chain, or sometimes we call it a few key elements in a food chain. So first of all, producers. What are producers? Producers are organisms that make its own food. So make its own food. So the first thing that comes into our mind would be plant, alright? So plant can make their own food. So they are called the producers in a food chain. Whereas consumers are actually animals that feeds on other living things. So in the food chain, remember, there is a producer and there is a consumer. So let's look at some keywords in a food chain. First of all, herbivores. So herbivores are animals that eat only plants. They only eat plants, all right? So in this diagram here, you have a cow, you have a giraffe, you have a goat. So these animals, they feed on plant only. So when it comes to animals that feeds on other animals, we call them carnivores. So here we have a leopard, we have a crocodile, we have a shark. So these are examples of carnivores. And we also have another word called omnivores. So omnivores are animals that eat both plants and animals. So example of omnivores are human, right? Human, we eat vegetables such as broccoli, cabbage, and sometimes we eat meat. So we can eat meat, so like fried chicken, pork belly, what else you have? Steak, lobsters, all right? So like a human is an example of omnivore. And yes, here is a food chain. So what is a food chain? A food chain is a list with arrows that shows what eats what in a habitat. So in this diagram here, this is an example of a food chain. So you can see in the food chain, we have the producer, the consumer. Alright, so we have 4 key players in this food chain here. So the producers, like I have mentioned just now, they are actually plants. And the consumers feeds on the producer. Alright, so the grasshopper is actually the primary consumer in this food chain. The frog, it feeds on the grasshopper, so it's called the secondary consumer. And lastly, we have the snake as the top predator in this food chain, or sometimes we call them the tertiary consumer. Alright, so again, remember, a food chain is a list with arrows that shows what eats what in a habitat. And when we have several food chains coming together, it forms a food web. So a food web consists of all the food chains in a single ecosystem. So in this diagram here, we can see there are various food chains, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, a lot of food chains. So when all of them, they interact with one another, it forms a food web. And of course, in the food chains, these are a few keywords. A primary consumer refers to the first consumer in a food chain. And the secondary consumers refers to the second consumer in a food chain. It always feeds on the primary consumer, okay? Whereas the primary consumers always feeds on a producer, right? So in this food chain here, you can see there's a plant, there's a mouse, there's a snake, and there's an eagle. So the plant is actually called the producer in this food chain. The mouse is called the primary consumer, whereas the snake, it's called the secondary consumer because it feeds on the primary consumer. And lastly, we have top predator in the food chain. So a top predator refers to the last predator. So if you look at this food chain, the last member in the food chain, they are always called a top predator. And or sometimes we call it a tertiary consumer as well. So if you notice in these food chains, there are arrows, right? The arrows pointing from the plant to the mouse, and the mouse to the snake, and so on. So the arrow in the food chain shows where does the energy flow, right? So where do we get the energy from, right? First of all, the energy comes from the sun. So the plant will actually trap the sun. They will actually trap the solar energy, and then that's where they collect the energy. So when the mouse feeds on the plant, it consumes the plant, and then the energy is transferred from the plant to the mouse, right? So the mouse has the energy right now, and when the snake feeds on the mouse, right, once the snake feeds on it, it will feel full, and then that's where it gets its energy. So at this time, the energy is actually transferred from the mouse to the snake. And when the eagle feeds on the snake, uh, by feeding on the snake, the energy will actually transfer to the eagle, right? So that's it for food chains. So I'll see you in the next topic and have fun learning. So students, remember, you can actually pause the video, take down your notes, all right? So please take down what all the notes, all the 12 points into your exercise book. All right, see you in the next class.